When was the New Testament written? It's a sort of a trick question because I'm going to clarify something. Was the New Testament written in this century or this century? Obviously, it was not written in the 21st century. It was written in the 1st century. And was the New Testament written in this area? Sorry, Texas, that is a terrible drawing of that state. No, it wasn't. It was written in Israel, way in the east. So, when we approach Scripture, even the New Testament, we have to remember this book was not written for you and me. It was not written for people living in the 21st century or in the USA. It was written for another people at another time in another place. And because of God's beautiful plan and care for His church, we get to enjoy this story today, the story captured in the New Testament. So, a couple of things that will help us be more effective in our reading of the New Testament. One is if we remember the context. Whenever I say context, I'm talking about historical context. So the fact that this was written at a time when the Roman Empire ruled and the Jewish people were awaiting salvation from that oppressor. It's also a cultural context, meaning the New Testament is written by Jewish people, which leads me to the next part. Jewish writings have their own literary context. People wrote differently than they do today back then. Today we have long novels, hundreds of pages long, that are full of vivid audio and visual descriptions of what it was like to be there. And that's how we communicate meaning. That was not the literary context of the New Testament. They spoke in a few details, and they would appeal to previous stories. Previous stories, you say? What previous stories? Well, let's move on to the second thing to remember when reading the New Testament. The second thing to remember is the Old Testament. These Jewish people, they had a holy book that informed all of their culture and literature, and it was the Old Testament. The way that you and I might consume movies and TV shows from a young age, they did that with the Old Testament. And so the literary context of the New Testament can't help but be informed by the Old Testament. Whenever we read the New Testament and don't consider how it's speaking to and from the Old Testament, that would be like listening to Jimi Hendrix and unplugging his electric guitar. There wouldn't be a lot there. It would be foolish for us to read the New Testament without reading the Old Testament and understanding it. Now, am I saying that you have to read Genesis before you read the book of John? No, by no means. In fact, John is a great book to start with, but it becomes better the more and more and more we read Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament, as an example. And then finally, the third part that we should know whenever we approach the New Testament is the person of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament ended with a silhouette, sort of an image of a person who had not yet come but was promised in the story. This person was the Messiah, God's chosen one from his line of David, God's chosen one who would come and would change everything, who would make all things new, who would conquer death and give all people a new life with God forever, who would defeat God's enemies and reconcile Israel to Yahweh, that's God himself. And the Old Testament ends with this person still a mystery. They're defined in some ways, but they have not yet arrived. And so, Jesus functions as a literary device and character, as well as obviously historical person, as a fulfillment of this image. So, the New Testament. we have to remember its context. Historically, it's written in the East during a time of Roman occupation by the minority group of the Jews. They had their own cultural ideas of how the world should work, and they had their own literary tradition to depict their stories. We also should remember the Old Testament and how the Old Testament informed this people group. Every author of the New Testament first learned the Old Testament and began to adopt a worldview that saw everything through that lens. And finally, we should remember it's all about Jesus. And that is how we can read the New Testament so wonderfully well.